When I worked at Paramount Pictures, one of the movies that was created was called The Net with Sandra Bullock. And as part of that, they were doing some kind of a reverse trace, trying to find out where the attacker was coming from. And it's very tough when the attacker has gone through multiple proxies. In this nugget, we'll take a look at why a proxy can help the attacker or hacker and do a demonstration of implementing one. We use proxies all the time for productive and legitimate purposes. For example, let's say we have Bob here at this computer and Bob's going out to the internet. It's very likely that Bob's traffic is going to be intercepted or proxied by some device on his local network before it goes out. Maybe the firewall is acting as a proxy, including doing services of network address translation, or perhaps we're going to a full-blown proxy server that's doing NAT itself and then sending out requests out to the internet. And for the benefit of Bob and our company, it helps protect the identity of Bob's real IP address on the internal network. And also on a full proxy server, it gives us the ability to analyze exactly what's going on with Bob's conversation to the internet and what's coming back. However, from a hacker/attacker perspective, there are three main reasons why they would do it. Number one, they definitely want to hide the source. For example, if the attacker is out here and they're at IP address 23.1.2.3, and they're sending their attacks in, they want to avoid being identified as coming from their real IP address. So using a technique like a proxy server or multiple proxies, they can disguise themselves and appear to be coming from a different IP address. And one method that's used by attackers is to do proxy chaining. So let's imagine we have 6 proxy servers, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. And this reminds me of a story that my dad told me. He was in the Marines, and one of the stories he told me was that they were low on supplies, and they hadn't had clothing supplies in a while. Until one day, one of the leaders came in and he said, I've got great news and bad news. The great news is everybody gets a change of underwear. The bad news is, Bob, you change with Larry. Larry, you change with Joe, etc. And the reason that applies to proxy chaining is the attacker at the address 23.1.2.3, he can go ahead and initially connect to proxy server 6, which can use proxy server 5, which uses 4, which uses 3, which uses 2, which uses 1, which then goes ahead and makes the connection to the victim. And at each step of the way, this can be encrypted, and the address can be changed at each step in the way as well. And that can make it very difficult for the victim, in this case, to track all the way back to the attacker to find out what his real IP address is. And in addition to the hiding and disguising the source IP address, an attacker may also use proxies to get access that otherwise wouldn't be available. For example, this firewall may have some rules that say there's absolutely no access from the outside to the inside. So here we have the outside zone, if you will. Here's the inside. And this is the DMZ, the demilitarized zone. Well, if the attacker can compromise a device on the DMZ, let's say that port 80 is allowed in for HTTP, with server 2 compromised, the attacker could install some proxy software on that server and have that server act as a proxy for further access into the network. So before the attack and the proxy was put in place, the attacker on the internet would not have access to the internal resources, but might after they install the proxy on a compromised DMZ device. For our example in our lab, let's do this. Let's use this Windows 8 machine and we'll have him be the client running his browser, and we'll train the browser to go ahead and use .210 as a proxy server. Now the trick or the trouble is that we need to have some software running on this Windows 2010 system to act as a proxy server. And for our example, let's use a tool called Proxy Workbench. And one of the defaults for Proxy Workbench is that when it receives HTTP requests on port 8080, it's going to go ahead and proxy those out to the internet. So what we'll also do when we set up our client, we'll tell it to use .210 as a proxy server. We'll also identify that we want to use port 8080 as well. And the question may come up, well, what if we want to do proxy chaining and have multiple proxies in the path? Well, what we could also do, instead of having Windows 10 go directly out to the internet, we could also install Proxy Workbench on another system and tell the Windows 10 system that it should use that proxy. And if we did that, then the actual request would go out to the internet source from .212 from the Windows 2012 proxy service. So let's begin at Windows 10, and we'll install Proxy Workbench to set up the proxy, and then we'll train our Windows 8 client to go ahead and use it. So here we're looking at the host that's running VMware Workstation. Let's select our Windows 8.1 machine. We'll start it. We'll also go ahead and start the Windows 10 machine. So right here on Windows 10, we'll make this guy full screen, and we'll bring up a browser. And what we're looking for is Proxy Workbench. And it's proxyworkbench.com is where we want to go. So we'll select that. We'll select the download link, and then we'll download the 30-day evaluation of Proxy Workbench. Now that that's downloaded, we'll go ahead and run it. It's not signed, but this is in a lab environment, so I'm going to go ahead and run it anyway. And then we'll click on next a few times to continue with the installation. I'll say yes to the user account control question, and we'll click on close, and it is now installed. To launch it, I'm going to click on the Windows icon in the bottom left-hand corner. And right here we have Proxy Workbench, which we can select, or we could just type in Proxy, and it would bring up Proxy Workbench from a list, and we can select it that way as well. So we'll launch Proxy Workbench. I'm going to allow it to communicate on public and private networks. Click on Allow Access. There's also a pop-up that tells us that there's some defaults in place, including any requests that come in on port 8080. It's going to proxy those HTTP requests out to the internet, which is great. We'll click on OK. To also verify that, here in the Configure Proxy Workbench window, we can select 8080. Over on the right, select HTTP. And then we can click on Configure HTTP for port 8080 just to verify. So effectively what this means is that requests that come in on port 8080 to this computer will be proxied out to the internet to servers on port 80, which is the well-known port for HTTP. Now also, while we're right here in this configuration window, if we wanted to tell this Windows 10 machine to use another proxy in a chain of proxies, we could go ahead and select this radio button right here, connect via another proxy, put the next proxy's IP address or DNS name if it was resolvable, and the port that that second proxy would be listening on. For now, we're just going to use the one proxy, this Windows 10 machine, so we'll click on OK, and we'll click on Close. If we wanted to bring up that configuration window again, we just click on this little icon here for Configure Ports and Protocols. Also, in this window, it'll show us any activity regarding proxy services that Proxy Workbench is providing. So there's a little teeny challenge here, and that is there's nobody trained to use this proxy server yet. So let's solve that by going over to our Windows 8.1 computer, and we'll tell the browser on that Windows 8.1 computer to go ahead and use this proxy server for web requests. So we'll hop over to our Windows 8.1 computer. We'll log on. I'm going to adjust my screen resolution a little bit so that it looks better in this display. And then let's launch Internet Explorer. And to configure it, we're going to use the configuration gear in the upper right-hand corner, and we'll go down to Internet Options. Now, depending on your browser and what version it is, the controls and the locations may be slightly different. For example, Chrome or Firefox will have slightly different locations. And one thing that's in common is they all have the option of selecting a proxy server to use for web requests. So here in Internet Explorer, if we go under Connections, and then down here near the bottom we select LAN settings, we can go ahead and click on the checkbox to use a proxy server, and then we'll put in the IP address of our Windows 10 machine that's running the Proxy Workbench. And that IP address is 192.168.1.210. And the port is going to be 8080. And then we'll click on OK. And OK again. And just for grins, we're going to close Internet Explorer, and then we'll launch it again to verify whether or not the proxy is working. Now, to verify that's working, let's go back to our Windows 10 computer. We'll say no to the Java auto update. And we can see here we can verify the actual traffic. So for HTTP proxy services on port 8080, here are all the requests that is received and is forwarded out to the live internet. And on the MSN page, there's rotating screens, which is causing more activity, and that's why we have the real-time data being updated, reflecting that activity. In this nugget, we've discussed how proxy servers can help hide the identity of an attacker. We also demonstrated one using Proxy Workbench. And what I would encourage you to do is lab all of this up on your own and take some additional time in practicing and playing with the tools that we've demonstrated in this course. Meanwhile, I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.